Rookie cop Sarah Kincaid thought she knew what justice looked like, until the day she wrongfully arrested an innocent black man and watched her entire world shatter in a courtroom. When Judge Elijah Carter, a man who was once wrongfully imprisoned, himself exposes the truth, Sarah is forced to confront a terrifying reality. Her department isn't about protecting and serving, it's about covering up and controlling. As she digs deeper, she unravels a massive police corruption ring, but the closer she gets to the truth, the more dangerous it becomes. Her own brothers in blue turn against her. Lies, threats, a target on her back. Now, she must make an impossible choice. Stay silent and safe or risk everything to bring justice to those who never had a voice. Before we start, buckle up, get ready, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow, I've got a special surprise you won't want to miss. Sarah Kincaid tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her pulse steady as she cruised through the dimly lit streets of Southside. The radio crackled with scattered updates from other units, but her mind was elsewhere, on proving herself. Tonight marked her third month on patrol, and she was already tired of being seen as the rookie. She wanted respect, to show the department she belonged. She had worked too hard to get here, and nothing was going to slow her down. Beside her, Detective Craig Halston sipped his coffee, barely paying attention. He had been on the force for over 20 years, and to him, this was just another night. "You gotta stop looking like you're waiting for something big to happen," he muttered. "Most of this job is routine. The big stuff comes when you least expect it." Sarah nodded, but she didn't believe that. The big stuff came to the cops who were willing to chase it down. Then, the radio cut through the silence. Unit 12, possible, armed robbery, corner of Grant and 5th. Suspect description: black male, mid-30s, gray hoodie, dark jeans. Witness reports he fled eastbound. Halston glanced at Sarah. "That's 2 blocks from here." "Light it up." She hit the siren and floored the gas. Adrenaline surged through her veins as they sped through the intersection, tires screeching as they rounded the corner. The streets were quiet except for the distant hum of late-night traffic. Then, she saw him. A man matching the description walked along the sidewalk, hands in his pockets. He turned his head at the sound of the siren, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "There," Sarah said sharply. Halston gave a slight nod. "Let's see what he's about." Sarah threw the car into park and stepped out, hand resting on her holster. "Sir, stop where you are." The man paused, clearly startled. "What's going on?" "Hands where we can see them," she ordered. He hesitated. "I just got off work." "What's this about?" "Hands up," Halston barked, stepping beside her. The man exhaled sharply but complied, raising his hands. "I didn't do anything." Sarah moved closer, scanning his hoodie and jeans. Gray, dark, it fit. Her training told her hesitation could mean danger. "Turn around, hands on your head. Are you serious?" His voice cracked with frustration. "I just picked up my daughter from my mom's house. Just do it," Halston muttered. The man swallowed hard, then slowly turned. Sarah moved in, grabbing his wrist. The moment the cuffs clicked shut, she heard a small voice. "Daddy?" She turned and saw a little girl, no older than 6, standing on the porch of a small house. She clutched a teddy bear to her chest, eyes wide with fear. Sarah hesitated. For the first time tonight, something felt wrong, but Halston was already pulling the man toward the car. "Let's go," he said. Sarah followed, ignoring the unease crawling up her spine. The ride back to the precinct was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of handcuffs as the man shifted in the back seat. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, her grip tight on the wheel, but she could feel the weight of his stare in the rearview mirror. His breathing was controlled, but there was tension behind it, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I didn't do anything," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "You match the description," Sarah said flatly. "You mean I match a vague-ass description of black man in a hoodie?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "That's all it takes, huh?" Sarah ignored him. She had been trained not to engage in backseat debates. The department always drilled into them. Stick to the facts, keep control of the situation. Still, something about this one gnawed at her. Halston, unfazed, reached for his coffee. "You got priors?" The man laughed dryly. "You already ran my ID. You tell me." Sarah had, in fact, already checked. Clean record. No outstanding warrants, nothing suspicious. But the call had come in, and she had done her job. That was what mattered. They pulled into the precinct lot, and Sarah parked near the processing entrance. As soon as she opened the door, the man turned toward her, his face unreadable. "My name's Darius, by the way," he said, "since you didn't bother to ask." Sarah hesitated for half a second before gripping his arm and guiding him out of the car. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to acknowledge it. Maybe it was the way he said it, like he already knew she wasn't going to care. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Darius was led through booking. The process was routine, mechanical, fingerprints, photographs, paperwork. Through it all, he kept his shoulders squared, his expression blank, but his eyes, those told another story. "You have someone who can post bail?" Sarah asked as she handed his file over to the officer at the desk. "My mom," he said, "but she shouldn't have to." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she watched as he was led toward holding, the steel bars closing behind him with a dull clang. The shift moved on, but the tension lingered. Sarah found herself staring at the arrest report on her desk, fingers tapping against the surface. The details felt flimsy now, thin. She had followed protocol. She had done what she was supposed to do. So why did it feel off? "Something bothering you, Kincaid?" Halston asked as he leaned against the doorway of her cubicle. She straightened. "No, just writing up the report." Halston nodded, smirking. "Get used to it. You do this long enough, you stop second-guessing yourself." Sarah nodded, but as Halston walked away, she glanced at the report again. For some reason, she didn't feel like stopping just yet. The courtroom was colder than Sarah expected. The hum of voices echoed off the high ceilings, blending with the rhythmic clicking of keyboards as clerks typed away. She adjusted her collar, shifting in her seat at the witness stand, eyes locked on the man in the defendant's chair. Darius sat straight-backed, his expression unreadable, hands folded neatly in his lap. Unlike the night of his arrest, he didn't look confused or afraid. He just looked done. Sarah forced herself to focus, gripping the edges of her statement as the prosecutor ran through the formalities. It was a simple case, an easy win. The call had come in, the description had matched. They had found Darius near the reported crime scene. Routine. But when Judge Elijah Carter leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking onto her, the routine started to unravel. "Officer Kincaid," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "walk me through the arrest again." She straightened. "We responded to a robbery in progress. Witness described a black male in a gray hoodie and dark jeans. When we arrived, we saw the defendant." "Darius," Carter corrected. "His name is Darius Cole." Sarah hesitated but nodded. "We saw Mr. Cole walking eastbound, approximately 2 blocks from the scene. He matched the description, so we detained him for questioning." Carter tapped his fingers against his desk. "You mean you arrested him?" Sarah's jaw tensed. "Yes, sir. Based on the circumstances, we had probable cause." Carter let out a small breath like he'd heard it all before. "Officer Kincaid, were there any surveillance cameras in the area?" She blinked. I don't know. Did you check?" Sarah hesitated. She hadn't. She and Halston had assumed the description was enough. The department's policy was to bring in suspects first, sort out the details later. Carter turned to the defense attorney, who stood and walked toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. With a click of a remote, grainy surveillance footage played, Sarah's stomach tightened. The video showed the robbery, clear as day. The suspect sprinted out of the convenience store, his hoodie flapping open as he ran. He was taller than Darius, leaner, and worst of all, he wore white sneakers, not the dark ones Darius had on that night. Carter let the silence settle before he spoke. "Officer Kincaid, is that Darius Cole robbing the store?" Sarah's throat went dry. "No," she admitted. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Darius didn't flinch, didn't even turn toward her. His mother, seated in the back, covered her mouth, shaking her head. Carter leaned forward. "Then why is he sitting in my courtroom right now?" Sarah felt something twist deep inside her. The answer should have been simple. Procedure, probable, cause. The system working as designed. But as Carter stared at her, waiting, she realized the truth. The system wasn't working. It was rigged. Sarah sat in the judge's chambers, the thick silence pressing in on her. Judge Elijah Carter leaned back in his chair, hands folded, studying her like he was trying to see past the uniform, past the badge, straight into whatever was underneath. She had spent her entire career believing in the system, but for the first time under his gaze she felt exposed. "You want to tell me what happened out there, Officer Kincaid?" Carter finally said. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. Sarah cleared her throat, trying to keep her tone even. "I responded to a call. The description matched. The description was vague," Carter cut in. "And it didn't match." "Not really. You just told an entire courtroom that you arrested a man without checking evidence. You tell me, officer. Is that what justice looks like?" Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was not how this was supposed to go. She had made an arrest based on probable cause. That was the job. "Sir, with all due respect, we don't always have the luxury of hindsight. When you're in the field, you have to make quick decisions." Carter nodded slowly, considering her words. "I understand that. But tell me something, officer. How many of these quick decisions do you think have put innocent men behind bars?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Carter reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick file, sliding it across the desk toward her. "This is my case file, the one that got me locked up for 5 years." Sarah hesitated before picking it up. The pages were old, creased at the edges. She skimmed through the first few reports. False testimony, fabricated evidence, an officer's word against his. And then a conviction. 23 years old, Carter said, watching her read. First year out of law school. I was driving home from a friend's house when I got pulled over for matching a description. That was all it took. Sarah forced herself to keep looking at the pages. Even as her stomach twisted, Carter continued, his voice steady. I spent 5 years in a cell because a cop made a bad call. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. Either way, I almost lost everything. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I get it, Carter said softer now. You're new. You trust the people training you. You think the system is what keeps people safe. He leaned in. But I want you to ask yourself something, officer. Who does it really keep safe? Sarah clenched her jaw, pushing down the unease creeping up her spine. Carter sat back, exhaling. Take the file, read it, then decide if you still want to. Be the kind of cop who just follows orders. Sarah hesitated, then grabbed the file. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. Sarah sat in her squad car outside her apartment, gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. The case file Judge Carter had given her lay on the passenger seat, the pages slightly curled at the edges from where she had flipped through them a dozen times. Every report, every name, every conviction, it all felt like a punch to the gut. She had spent the last few hours trying to convince herself that this was a mistake, that these were isolated incidents, not a pattern, but deep down, something gnawed at her, a whisper in the back of her mind telling her that if she looked too hard she wouldn't like what she found. Her phone buzzed. Halston. Rookie. Don't overthink today. You did your job. She exhaled slowly, staring at the message. Halston was her mentor, the one who had taken her under his wing. He had always told her not to second-guess herself. That hesitation got people killed. But hesitation wasn't what was bothering her. It was something worse. She grabbed the file and pushed open the car door, stepping into the cool night air. If she was going to get any sleep, she needed answers. The next morning, Sarah walked into the precinct with her heart hammering in her chest. She had spent the whole night combing through the names in Carter's file, cross-referencing them with arrest records in her own department. What she found made her stomach twist. The same officers appeared again and again. Repeated wrongful arrests, patterns of missing evidence, cases that never should have made it to trial. She needed to talk to someone who wouldn't dismiss her, someone who might actually listen. She found Officer Ryan Mills leaning against the break room counter, scrolling through his phone. He was one of the few people in the precinct she considered a friend, someone who hadn't been completely hardened by the job. Mills, she said, keeping her voice low. You ever notice anything off about some of these arrests? He glanced up, raising an eyebrow. What are you talking about? She hesitated, then handed him the case file. These are wrongful convictions. All tied to our department. Mills skimmed the pages, his face unreadable. Where'd you get this? Judge Carter, she admitted. Look, I don't want to believe it either, but something isn't right. Some of these names, I've seen them before, Ryan. Mills exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Sarah, listen to me. This isn't your fight. You're new. You start poking around and stuff like this, you won't last here. She frowned. So what? We just ignore it? I'm saying, Mills said carefully, handing the file back, there are people in this department who don't like questions, and they sure as hell don't like rookies making accusations. Sarah's stomach tightened. Drop it, Mills said, for your own good, but Sarah knew she wouldn't. Sarah sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard as she stared at the department's database. The precinct bustled around her, phones ringing, officers swapping jokes. The distant hum of the television in the break room, but she barely heard any of it. Her mind was focused on one thing, the names in Carter's file. She had spent the last hour digging through records, pulling up old arrests, looking for patterns, and they were there, buried beneath layers of official reports. The same officers' names popped up again and again. Not just wrongful arrests, cases where evidence had been misplaced, witness statements had mysteriously changed, and suspects had taken plea deals despite overwhelming proof of their innocence. The pieces were coming together, and they painted a picture she didn't want to see. A knock on her cubicle wall snapped her out of it. She looked up to see Halston standing there, arms crossed. You got a minute, rookie? He asked, his voice light but firm. Sarah closed the database and nodded, following him down the hall to the briefing room. The moment she stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind her. Halston leaned against the table, his gaze sharp. Heard you've been asking questions. Sarah kept her face neutral. Just reviewing some cases. Cases that don't concern you. She swallowed. They should concern all of us. Halston sighed, rubbing his temple. Listen, Kincaid, You're new, so I'm going to give you some advice. This job isn't about playing detective on your own, guys. It's about trust. Sarah clenched her fists. Trust goes both ways. Halston's expression darkened. We look out for each other in this department. Always have, always will. I'd hate to see you make the kind of mistake that gets you on the wrong side of that. There it was, the warning. Sarah forced herself to hold his gaze. I'm just following the truth. Halston chuckled, shaking his head. The truth? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You don't get it yet, do you? This isn't about truth, it's about control. And if you think Judge Carter's got your back, you're in for a rude awakening. A chill ran down her spine. Do yourself a favor, he continued. Forget whatever Carter told you. Forget the files. Focus on being a cop, not a problem. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Halston studied her for a moment before nodding to himself. Then he patted her shoulder and walked past her, leaving the room. She stood there, heart pounding. The message was clear. Drop it or there would be consequences. But as she looked down at the file clutched in her hands, she knew she had already made her choice. She wasn't going to stop, even if it meant going up against her own department. Sarah sat alone in her squad car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers ached. The weight of Halston's warning still pressed on her chest, but it wasn't fear that kept her up tonight. It was anger. Anger at the corruption, anger at the lies, anger at herself for ever believing that the badge automatically made someone honorable. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. She glanced at the screen. A text from Judge Carter. Meet me. Now. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before turning the ignition. The diner was nearly empty when she arrived, the neon sign buzzing faintly against the quiet of the night. Carter sat in a booth at the back, his eyes scanning the room even as he took a slow sip of coffee. Sarah slid into the seat across from him. You look like hell, Carter said, setting his cup down. She let out a dry laugh. Been a long couple of days. Carter nodded, sliding a small folder across the table. You're not the first to try digging into this mess, Kincaid, and you won't be the last. She opened the folder and felt her stomach turn. Inside were memos, emails, and reports, all linking her precinct to a systematic cover-up, falsified evidence, intimidated witnesses, framed suspects. Her eyes landed on a familiar name, Officer Ryan Mills. Her mouth went dry. No, Mills wouldn't. He's deep in it, Carter said. Not as high up as Halston, but involved enough to know exactly what's going on. Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had trusted Mills. He had warned her to back off. Was that because he was trying to protect her, or protect himself? Carter leaned forward. This isn't just about a few bad arrests. This is an organized network. Officers boosting conviction numbers to pad promotions. Narcotics detectives skimming drugs off busts. People in your own department making sure none of it ever sees daylight. Sarah closed the folder, bile rising in her throat. They know you're asking questions, Carter continued. That makes you a problem. Sarah exhaled sharply. So what do I do? Just let it go? Carter gave her a hard look. If you let this go, you'll spend the rest of your career looking the other way. And the moment you cross the wrong person, they'll still come for you. She didn't want to hear that, but she knew he was right. Her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. You're making a mistake. Stop now. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Carter saw the look on her face. You need to decide, Kincaid. Are you going to let them scare you off, or are you going to take them down? Sarah clenched her fists. She already knew the answer. She just wasn't sure if she'd survive it. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined hands tightening around her throat, a bullet shattering her windshield, footsteps trailing behind her in the dark. Fear wasn't something she was used to. Not like this. Not the kind that wrapped around her ribs and squeezed. By morning, she had made her decision. If they wanted her scared, she'd make them scared first. She pulled into the precinct lot, stepping out with her shoulders squared. The moment she walked through the doors, she felt eyes on her. The usual chatter in the station felt different now, quieter, sharper, like they all knew something she didn't. She made her way to the records room, forcing herself to move like nothing was wrong. But before she could enter, a hand clamped around her wrist. Ryan Mills. She turned and his face was carefully blank, but his grip was tight. Come with me, he said. She yanked her arm free. I'm busy. His jaw tightened. Now, Sarah hesitated, then followed him down the hall into an empty interrogation room. The moment the door shut, Mills turned to her, eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. Anger, worry, maybe both. What the hell are you doing? He hissed. Sarah crossed her arms, looking for the truth. Mills let out a bitter laugh. The truth? You think you're some kind of hero? You think you're gonna fix this? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You have no idea how deep this goes. Then why don't you tell me? Sarah shot back. Mills exhaled. rubbing a hand over his face. "You're being watched, Kincaid. They already know you met with Carter. They know you've been digging. You're walking a fine line." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. "So what? They'll frame me? Make me disappear?" Mills didn't answer. That silence told her everything she needed to know. Sarah swallowed hard. "You're in on it, aren't you?" Mills didn't deny it. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple." Her voice was sharp now. "You're either part of the problem, or you fix it." His eyes flickered with something. Regret, maybe. But then he straightened, his expression hardening. "Drop it, Sarah. That's the last warning you're getting." She held his gaze, her heart hammering. Then she turned and walked out, every step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached her desk, her stomach twisted. Her computer was on. She hadn't left it that way. A single file was open on the screen, her personnel report. She scrolled down and saw a new note added at the bottom. "Internal review pending. Misconduct inquiry." Her blood ran cold. They were setting her up. She grabbed her bag and bolted from the station. She needed to move fast, because if they were already making their move, it meant she was running out of time. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. They were coming for her. Not later, not eventually. Now. The misconduct inquiry was just the beginning. They were setting the stage to discredit her, isolate her, and when the time was right, bury her. She pressed down on the gas, weaving through traffic, dialing Judge Carter's number with her free hand. He answered on the second ring. "Talk to me. They're moving," she said, her voice tight. "They flagged my file for an internal review. I don't have time." Carter cursed under his breath. "Where are you now?" "Driving, heading toward your office." "No," he said immediately. "They'll be watching me. You need to go public now." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Go public? With what? I don't have enough evidence." "You have enough," Carter countered. "The files, the recordings, everything we've put together. It's time. If you wait, they'll control the story. You need to control it first." Sarah clenched her jaw. It was a risk, but he was right. If she let the department dictate the narrative, she'd be painted as a rogue cop, a liability. By the time the truth came out, if it ever did, she'd be nothing but a disgraced officer with no credibility. She swerved onto a quieter road and pulled into an empty parking lot. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Then she made the call. The reporter answered on the first ring. "This is Jenna Alvarez, Channel 7 News." Sarah swallowed hard. "I have a story for you." 30 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Jenna in a dimly lit coffee shop, her back to the door. The reporter had a small recorder on the table, her pen poised above a notepad. "Are you sure about this?" Jenna asked. "Once we go on record, there's no taking it back." Sarah exhaled. "I don't have a choice." She pushed a USB drive across the table. "Inside are files tying officers in my precinct to wrongful arrests, falsified reports, planted evidence. I also have a recorded conversation proving they're trying to silence me." Jenna's eyes widened. "Who's on the recording?" Sarah hesitated. Then she said it. "Ryan Mills." The reporter sat back, whistling. "That's a name. He's one of the department's golden boys." "Not for long," Sarah muttered. Jenna tucked the USB into her bag. "I'll run with this, but you need to be careful. The moment this goes live, they'll come at you harder." Sarah nodded, already feeling the weight of what she had just done. As she stood to leave, her phone buzzed with a new message. "Unknown number. Too late." Her stomach flipped. She turned toward the window just in time to see the dark SUV parked across the street. The driver was watching her. They knew, and they were coming. Sarah didn't wait. The moment she saw the SUV, she grabbed her bag and pushed out of the coffee shop, her pulse hammering. She moved fast, weaving through pedestrians, cutting between parked cars. She didn't have a plan, just instincts. Get away, lose them, survive. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "You should have listened." A chill ran down her spine. She didn't need to look back to know the SUV was moving. Sarah sprinted toward the nearest alley, her boots pounding against the pavement. She darted between dumpsters, leaped over a stack of wooden pallets and emerged on the other side, heart racing. The streets were busier here, people rushing home from work, cars honking. She blended into the crowd, forcing herself to slow her pace to breathe. The SUV rolled past, slow and deliberate, scanning the sidewalks. She ducked her head, turning away, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then her phone rang. "Carter," she answered, voice low. "They're here. Where are you?" His tone was clipped, urgent. "Downtown. I think I lost them." "No, you didn't." Carter's voice was sharp. "They're watching you. They're just waiting for the right moment." Sarah gritted her teeth. "What do I do?" A pause. Then, "You need to leave the city. Now." Sarah stopped walking. "What?" "Listen to me, Kincaid," Carter said. "You think this ends with a news report? It doesn't. You just put a target on your back, and these people don't play fair. They will ruin you, frame you. Hell, if they have to, they'll kill you." And no one will ask questions. Sarah clenched her jaw. She had known this was dangerous, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. "I'm not running," she said. "You think you can fight this from the inside? Wake up. You've already been pushed out, you're suspended, they'll make sure you never wear that badge again. So what's left?" Sarah swallowed hard. "The truth." Carter exhaled. "Then you need to go somewhere safe until this story hits. Once it's public, once the feds start looking, they won't be able to touch you. But if you're standing in the open when this all breaks..." Sarah didn't need him to finish. She looked around, weighing her options. She had a friend in another district, someone who wasn't dirty, someone she could trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "All right," she said. "I'll lay low." "Good." Carter paused. "And Sarah?" "Yeah, don't trust anyone." She ended the call and took one last glance over her shoulder. The SUV was gone, but that didn't mean they weren't still watching. She turned and walked, blending back into the crowd. She had one chance to survive this, and she wasn't going to waste it. Sarah sat in a dimly lit motel room, the weight of everything pressing down on her like a laid blanket. The air was stale, the cheap curtains drawn shut, but she didn't dare turn on the TV. She didn't need to see the news to know what was happening. The moment Jenna Alvarez's story hit, the city would erupt. The department would go into damage control, spinning the narrative, trying to make her look like a disgruntled cop, a liar, and the men who wanted her gone, they wouldn't just sit back and watch. Her phone sat on the table, face down, vibrating every few minutes. Messages, calls, some from Jenna, some from unknown numbers. She ignored them all. If someone wanted to find her, they already knew how. A knock at the door made her freeze. Her gun was already in her hand before she stood, her pulse thudding in her ears. She moved toward the peephole, heart hammering. "Carter." She exhaled sharply and unlocked the door, stepping aside as he entered quickly. He looked exhausted, but his expression was grim. He set a folded newspaper on the table. Sarah didn't have to read the headline. "City in turmoil. Police corruption. Scandal shakes department." She pulled out a chair and sat down, running a hand through her hair. "How bad is it?" Carter let out a short laugh. "That depends on who you ask. Half the city is demanding resignations. The other half thinks you're a traitor." Sarah swallowed hard. She knew this wouldn't be easy. She just hadn't expected it to feel so damn lonely. Carter pulled out his phone and scrolled for a second before turning the screen toward her. It was a video clip, a press conference. Detective Halston. She tensed as the video played, deeply disappointed in the reckless accusations made against this department. Officer Kincaid was an inexperienced officer, easily manipulated by outside influences, and unfortunately, she allowed herself to be used to spread falsehoods. Sarah clenched her fists. "That son of a..." Carter shut off the video. "It's exactly what we expected. They're making you the scapegoat." She shook her head, rage curling in her gut. "And Mills?" Carter's face darkened. "Gone." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean, gone?" "He turned himself in last night, cut a deal with the feds. He's talking." Sarah felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. Mills had warned her, tried to scare her off, but in the end, he had broken. Carter sat back. "This isn't over, Kincaid. The feds are in now. People are going down. But you..." He met her eyes. "You'll never wear that badge again." Sarah already knew that, and maybe, just maybe, she was okay with it, because for the first time in her career, she had actually done something that mattered. Sarah stood outside the courthouse, the cold air biting at her skin as the city moved around her. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing, their microphones reaching toward her like open hands. She kept walking, head down, ignoring the noise. It had been 2 weeks since the story broke. 2 weeks since the department imploded, since the federal investigations began, since the protests filled the streets demanding justice. 2 weeks since she'd turned in her badge. She hadn't even fought it. When Internal Affairs called her, instant she knew what was coming. Her credibility was shot, her reputation stained beyond repair. She could have fought for her job, could have tried to argue that she was the only one doing the right thing, but she didn't want to be a cop anymore, not in a system that rewarded silence and punished truth. A familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Darius Cole standing near the steps, hands in his pockets. He was free now, but there was no relief in his eyes, just a quiet understanding. She walked over, stopping a few feet away. "How's your daughter?" Darius nodded, slowly. "She's good, doesn't really understand what happened, but she's good." Sarah exhaled, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "I'm sorry." Darius studied her for a moment. "For what?" "For arresting you, for not seeing it sooner." He let out a short breath, shaking his head. "You saw it when it mattered." She looked down at the pavement, the weight of everything settling into her bones. "It's not enough. It never is." They stood there in silence for a moment. the sounds of the city filling the space between them. Then Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to her. She took it hesitantly. Unfolding it, it was a name, a case number. Sarah looked up, brow furrowed. "What is this?" Darius's expression was hard. "A man I did time with, said he was framed just like I was." He paused. "Told me if I ever found someone who actually gave a damn, I should pass his name along." Sarah stared at the paper, her heart hammering. "You don't owe him anything," Darius said. "You don't owe anyone anything." She swallowed hard, but as she stared at the name, something settled inside her, something that felt a lot like purpose. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. "I'll look into it." Darius gave her a small nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Sarah stood there for a moment, then took a deep breath and headed in the opposite direction. She wasn't a cop anymore, but maybe, just maybe, she was finally something better.